Some weekends in NASCAR leave you thinking long after the checkered flag drops. And this was absolutely one of them. What unfolded on track had the kind of weight that shifts the entire direction of a driver's season, and simultaneously, the sport itself was approaching one of those rare scheduling moments tied deeply to tradition. Two completely different stories, but both carrying real significance for anyone who follows this sport seriously. Everything came to a head at Martinsville Speedway. And if you understand what that track demands from drivers, you already know the conditions were perfect for something to explode. Martinsville is a paperclip-shaped short track with tight corners, minimal runoff, and absolutely no margin for error, especially in the closing laps when positions are everything and tempers are already running hot. That is the environment where this all played out, deep in the race on lap 324, when every single point and every single position carries maximum pressure. The tension between Bubba Wallace and Carson Hocevar had already been building before the critical moment arrived. Hocevar had gone 3 wide into turn 1 on a restart earlier, putting Wallace in an uncomfortable and aggressive situation. That kind of move at a track like Martinsville is not subtle. It sends a message, and not every driver on that track is going to absorb it quietly and move on. The frustration was already there beneath the surface, waiting for the next flashpoint. Then came the moment that changed everything. Wallace went into turn 3 and made contact with Hocevar, and this was not the kind of incidental short-track nudge that gets brushed off after the race. He hit him once going into the corner, and then a second time through the middle of it, and that second contact was the one that truly sent the situation spiraling. Hocevar got turned, lost control, and what followed was a massive pileup across the front stretch that collected multiple cars and fundamentally altered the race result for a large group of drivers who had absolutely nothing to do with the conflict between these two. The reaction from the NASCAR community came quickly, and it came honestly. 7-time champion Richard Petty addressed the incident on his Petty Race Recap podcast alongside Dale Inman, and he did not soften his words. When Inman described it as Wallace kind of getting into the 77, Petty pushed back immediately and directly. In his view, this was not a light tap or a borderline racing moment. He said Wallace drove in there and knocked the door off Hocevar, and when you go back and watch the replay with that perspective in mind, the description feels accurate. The move looks deliberate in its aggression, even if the intent behind it remains a separate question entirely. Bubba Wallace gave his own account to Jamie Little after the incident, and to his credit, he did not deflect or make excuses. He owned the moment completely. He acknowledged that he did not appreciate the 3-wide move into turn 1 that Hocevar had put on him, but he was equally clear that wrecking him was never the intention. According to Wallace, he simply misjudged the center of the corner, and that miscalculation was all it took for everything to go wrong. And in isolation, that explanation is actually believable because Martinsville is exactly the kind of track where being even slightly off your reference point leads to contact. And contact at that track tends to cascade into something much larger very fast. But the explanation, however honest it may have been, could not undo the damage that moment caused to his season. Wallace came into that race sitting 3rd in the point standings, which represented real momentum and a genuine claim to being a championship-level contender in 2025. He finished the day in 36th position and dropped into a 4-way tie that realistically places him around 11th when everything is properly sorted out. That is not a minor setback, that is a significant point swing in the wrong direction at a stage of the season when building consistency and protecting your standing should be the entire focus. The most telling response came from his crew chief, Freddie Kraft, who spoke on the Door Bumper Clear podcast and chose honesty over diplomacy. Kraft said there was no way to sugarcoat it. If Wallace says he misjudged the situation, then the team takes him at his word, but it was a really bad misjudgment at a really bad time. The part that Kraft emphasized most strongly was this: moments like that simply cannot happen if this team wants to be taken seriously as a championship contender. Not occasionally, not rarely, cannot happen at all. Because when you are genuinely competing for a title, every single point on the board matters, and surrendering that many in one self-inflicted moment is precisely how championship runs quietly fall apart before they ever fully develop. That is the part that stings the most from a fan perspective, because Wallace had been building something real this season. The speed was there, the consistency was there, and the composure had looked championship-worthy through much of the early schedule. He was positioning himself to be genuinely discussed as a title threat rather than just a hopeful. And then one moment at Martinsville changed the conversation entirely, shifting it from contender talk to recovery mode almost overnight. The second story feels entirely different in tone and texture, but it matters just as much to anyone who follows the rhythm of the NASCAR season closely. There was no Cup Series race on April 5th, and the reason is rooted in one of the longest-standing traditions the sport has maintained across its entire history. NASCAR has an almost universal policy of not racing on Easter Sunday, and the numbers behind that tradition are striking when you actually look at them. In the entire history of the Cup Series, racing on Easter has happened only 14 times, and the overwhelming majority of those occurred during the 1950s and 1960s when the sport was still finding its identity and its scheduling structure. After that era, NASCAR essentially stepped away from Easter racing as a matter of course. The only real exception in the modern era came in 1989, when a snowstorm forced the Richmond race to be postponed, and Easter Sunday became the only available makeup date. That was not a choice born from policy, it was a circumstance born from weather, and it remains an outlier rather than a precedent. More recently, NASCAR did experiment with returning to Easter weekend racing, using the Bristol Dirt Race in 2022 and 2023, and then Richmond in 2024, as test cases for whether the tradition could be revisited in a modern context. But heading into 2025 and 2026, the decision was made to return to the traditional break, and the Easter weekend is once again a pause in the Cup schedule rather than a race date. As a fan, there is something genuinely interesting about how that break feels. On one level, it is unusual to have a weekend without Cup racing during the active portion of the season, and for those who build their weekends around the race broadcast, the absence is noticeable. But on another level, there is something refreshing about a sport honoring a tradition that predates most of its current fan base. A reminder that NASCAR has a history and a set of rhythms that stretch back much further than recent memory. The weekend was not without racing, however. Both the NASCAR Truck Series and the NASCAR Xfinity Series were active at Rockingham Speedway, one of those beloved classic venues that fans are always grateful to see back on the schedule. The Truck Series ran the Black's Tire 200 on April 3rd at 4:30 in the afternoon on FS1, and the Xfinity Series followed with the North Carolina Education Lottery 250 on April 4th at 2:30 in the afternoon on the CW network. For fans who wanted racing action, it was available, just not from the Cup cars, and Rockingham is exactly the kind of track that makes those lower series races worth watching on their own merits. The Cup Series was set to return with the Food City 500 at Bristol Motor Speedway on April 12th, just after 3 in the afternoon on FS1. When you put these two stories together, they create an interesting dynamic that goes beyond just filling airtime with NASCAR content. On one side, you have a single moment at Martinsville that carries genuine consequences for one of the more compelling storylines of the season. On the other side, you have a scheduled pause that gives teams time to reset and regroup, but also gives the media cycle more room to breathe and more time to keep revisiting the stories that came out of the previous race weekend. For Bubba Wallace specifically, that combination of factors is a double-edged situation. The time off before Bristol gives his team the opportunity to work through what happened, address the mental and strategic elements that led to the misjudgment, and show up at Bristol Motor Speedway with a clear and focused mindset rather than carrying the immediate weight of a fresh disaster. That kind of reset has genuine value at the championship level, where the mental game is often just as important as the mechanical one. But the same break that allows his team to reset also means the Martinsville incident stays in the conversation longer than it otherwise might. There is no next race the following weekend to shift attention forward, no new storyline immediately available to push this one into the background. The incident stays in the spotlight, gets analyzed further, gets replayed more often, and arrives at Bristol with maximum visibility still attached to it. Every camera at Bristol is going to spend time on that 23 six-hour racing entry, and every commentator is going to reference what happened at Martinsville when discussing where Wallace's season stands. And that is precisely where the real measure of a driver gets taken. Not in the races where everything goes according to plan, and the car is fast, and the strategy is clean, and the result reflects the effort. The real measure comes in the races that follow the mistakes, when the team has to answer publicly for what went wrong, and the driver has to perform under the weight of a narrative that is not flattering. How Wallace races at Bristol, how he carries himself through that weekend, and what kind of result he puts together is going to say a great deal about what this season ultimately becomes for him. The honest assessment has to be that this one went too far, even accounting for the intensity that Martinsville demands and the frustration that Hochevar's earlier move created. Misjudgments happen at that track. They always have and they always will. But at this level of competition with this much on the line in the standings, the margin for that kind of costly error is essentially zero. When your own crew chief steps in front of a microphone and calls it out as plainly as Freddie Kraft did, the situation is not being overstated from the outside. It was a costly mistake made at a moment when the season was trending in exactly the right direction. And now, the work of recovering that momentum has to begin from a much less comfortable position in the standings than the one Wallace had earned for himself. The Easter break added a different kind of feeling to the schedule. And after the chaos of Martinsville, there was something almost appropriate about the sport, pausing to breathe before the next chapter. But Bristol is coming, and when that race weekend arrives, the conversation picks right back up where it left off.